So there are three major festivals in our calendar and really in the Buddhist calendar worldwide. So we've got the Buddha Day, as we call it, and Dharma Day, and Sangha Day. So it's Sangha Day we're celebrating today. But those three festivals are the main ones in the Buddhist year because each one is for one of the three jewels. Now they can be associated with events in the Buddha's life all those thousands of years ago, but they've come to be associated with the Buddha himself, with his teaching, and with his Sangha. And the three jewels are therefore considered the most precious things. That's why they're called jewels, because they're the most precious things in Buddhism. And sometimes we call those things to mind in a devotional context. So we do that, when we just salute the shrine, but there are more elaborate ways of kind of calling the Buddha to mind, the Dharma, his teaching, and the Sangha in a devotional context. And one of them is what we call the Tiratna Vandana, the praise or worship of the three jewels. So the context of that, it's not just about praise or worship. Actually, it involves going for refuge, which means taking those things seriously, being moved by them, and stimulated to move towards the ideals they represent. But within the context of the Tiratna Vandana, there's some very ancient epithets to help us recall the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And they can be found elsewhere in ancient Buddhist texts. And they've been brought in because they're the kind of essence of what is the Buddha, what is the Dharma, and what is the Sangha. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it's only too easy when you're in a room full of people chanting to just drift off, to go off somewhere else, to, just think about what you're going to have for tea when you get home or how much your leg hurts. But the point of chanting is to recall more vividly, with more awareness, what we're actually doing. The point of the chanting is to direct us towards the ideals that we hold, to remind us of the ideals that we hold. And so with the Tiratna Vandana, over the years, I've taught myself, as we chant it, to try and remember what the words are in Pali, what they mean in English. So there's a translation in the Puja book, but obviously we chant them in Pali, which is one of the traditional Indian Buddhist languages, and still used throughout the Southeast Asian, South Asian Buddhist world. But again, although there's a pleasant rhythm to it and it has its own effect, the best thing is if you can recall what you're doing and why you're doing it. So I want to go through actually all three sections: the section about the Buddha, the section about the Dharma, and the section about the Sangha. And then I want to expand on and comment on the section about the Sangha. So it starts, I won't talk about the initial salutation or the verses of going for refuge. I'll just talk about these epithets that describe or call to mind the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So it starts, iti piso, which Sangharakshita translates, such indeed is he. So it's really emphatic. It's like the beginning of a paean to the Buddha. Such indeed is he. And what is he? He's Bhagava. So you get that word actually quite generally these days in Indian spirituality. So in the West, we became aware of it with Bhagavan Sri Rajneesh, right? So Bhagavan is an honorific but it's quite an emotional sort of way of putting things. So it's recognizing that the Buddha had endless good qualities. So Sangha actually translates it as the richly endowed, which is a kind of paraphrase. Sometimes it's translated as blessed, but it's blessed with good qualities. So it's kind of seeing the Buddha, what he's got going for him. I mean, I think you could almost paraphrase it as magnificent or glorious. You're seeing the Buddha, wow, he is special. He has got so much going for him, so many good qualities to the pitch of perfection. That's Bhagava. And then you have Arahant. So he's Arahant it's taken from the wider Indian tradition where it meant worthy. It's related to the term Aryan, which of course is used in terms of those incomers to India who brought so much of Indian culture with them. But Sangha actually translates it as free. It does mean something like free or awake. So again, it's pitching us further into what the Buddha is. He's not just an unusually good person. He's Arahant. In fact, he is Samma Sambuddho, which is fully and perfectly awake, fully and perfectly enlightened. So he's an extraordinary being. From the Buddhist tradition's point of view, without parallel in our historical times. Even though his disciples may also be awake, after all, it's the Buddha who, in this phrase, is fully and perfectly awake. He discovered that path and awakened himself without help from others. And then it says he is Vicharcharana Sampanno. So that is, he has in equal measure knowledge and practice. So he understands the nature of things, and he's able to practice in the light of that. Now, at first glance, you might think, so what? But actually, we know in our own experience, it's relatively easy to understand something and very difficult sometimes to practice it. So there's all kinds of things. I've got a teenage son. He's 20 now, so he's not a teenager. But at the moment, he's actually living with me while he goes to university. And it's really interesting. He's working out what he needs to do, and that's very, very positive. But every so often he comes to me and says again, I know I need to do this. I really want to do this, but I haven't done it this week. So that's the way we are, isn't it? You know, the first thing that comes is that we work out what would be best for us, what we need to do. But lagging quite a long way behind that usually is our ability to achieve that. However, that's not true for the Buddha. So the Buddha is equal in knowledge and practice. And then he's Lokavidu. So he's a knower of the world. He understands the world we live in. He understands how it works. And he's Anuttaro Purisidhamma Sarati. So he's the utmost, the Anuttaro, the topmost of those who can guide people who want to train themselves. So he's the guide for anybody who wants to lead a spiritual life. So in the Buddhist tradition, the spiritual life is very active. You train yourself. It's not something you just go along with or you just believe in. It's something where you take yourself in hand. But to do that, he is the best guide of how you should do that. And he's therefore Sata Deva Manusana. He's the teacher of gods and men. So we already heard a story this morning from the Buddhist tradition, which had some yakshas in it. So in ancient Indian belief, there are all kinds of beings, not just human beings, not just animals, but all kinds of spirits and gods But the gods are not the creator God that we think of in the West. They're more like our Greek gods. They are powerful beings, but with their own faults, as it were, and their own desires. So they don't automatically understand the world or do the right thing within it. So the Buddha is both the teacher of gods and men. And then it just says, Buddho Bhagavati. So it just sort of repeats itself. This is what he is. He's the Buddha. He's the awakened one. He's this glorious human being. So it's a very kind of emotive. As I said, it's a sort of paean to the Buddha. It's really extolling his virtues, almost with wonderment, that he is all these things. And then you have the epithets for the Buddha's teaching. So we have Svakato Bhagavata Dhammo. So the Dhamma, the teaching of the Bhagavata. So in this context, take all those other things as read, it's the Buddha. So this is the Buddha's teaching. And the first thing that it is well communicated. It's well said, it's well spoken. This is how people remembered it. That not only did the Buddha understand, but that he taught brilliantly, not just intellectually, but he had that ability to touch people's hearts. Now, years ago, when I was studying at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, I had one particularly brilliant professor who did a course on ancient Indian thought and ideas. And he said something which I thought was very interesting about the Buddha. He asked us, he had the habit of asking his students difficult questions and berating us when we didn't get the answers. But he asked us what was different about the Buddha from previous Indian teachers in the spiritual tradition. Because there was a spiritual tradition before the Buddha. There were people who lived in the forest, who tried to practice in some way to achieve awakening. They didn't succeed, perhaps, but they were seekers, and they left society and went and lived in small groups in the forest and were seeking an understanding of life. So this professor asked us, well, what was the difference? We, of course, couldn't come up with an answer that satisfied him. But what he said was the difference was the Buddha came back from the forest. That was the crucial difference. So the Buddha started like that. If you remember from his life, he left home, he went through the traditional rite of, as it were, dying to the world. He went off into the forest. He practiced with certain teachers who were already there before going off on his own to seek on his own. But according to this professor, the crucial thing was that he came back. So he started a movement reaching out to people who weren't already seeking the truth. And as he went around his ordinary daily life, which was, of course, begging his food and staying in, little places, caves, under trees and so on, he talked to people, he met people, and he communicated to them in this way. So that's the first thing that people remembered. Then his teaching, the Buddha's Dharma, is sanditiko. So this means immediately apparent. So it's not something that you kind of take on board now and it's for when you die. It's not like if you're good now, you'll go to heaven. It's something that you should be able to see the effects of in this life. Immediately maybe that's very quick, but sometimes it is like that. Sometimes people come to one meditation class and they immediately get a result from their very first meditation. Or they hear the Buddha's teaching and immediately some penny drops and they understand something for the first time. So the Buddha's teaching is like that. It's easy to see because it has an effect, and that effect takes place in our ordinary everyday lives. And then it's akaliko. Sangharakshita translates that here as perennial, but it means timeless, literally. It's without time. It's not related to time. So the Buddha's teaching is always relevant. It's not related to a particular time and place. It's not related to a particular cultural understanding. The essence of the Buddha's teaching is timeless, because he's drawing his teaching from the nature of reality. It's his understanding of the nature, the principles that drive the world that we live in, including ourselves and our human behavior. It's his understanding of those principles, which are natural principles, which we misunderstand, we don't get, and that's where we go wrong. So that's always applicable. Even if this was a different world in a different galaxy, those principles that he discovered would still be the same, they would still be relevant. So they're timeless. You could say they're spaceless as well. And then his teaching is ehipassiko. Actually, that means come and see. Yeah? So Sangharakshita translates it as of the nature of a personal invitation. It is a personal invitation because it's a come and see. It's an invitation to come and see, come and practice, do it, see for yourself. So the Buddha often said this, he said, don't take my word for it. That even though you think I'm the Buddha and you respect me, don't take my word for it. You put it into practice and see for yourself. If I'm right, carry on. If I'm wrong, do something else. So he was very, very confident in what he discovered. He didn't feel that he needed to twist people's arm. Just come and see, try it. You'll like it. That was his approach. And then it's opanayiko. It's methodical, it's progressive. So sometimes we use the word developmental. So, you go step by step. Even though there are some benefits immediately, you don't get all the benefits immediately. And the Buddha's teaching takes you step by step, as appropriate to you, as an individual, in your context, from where you are now, potentially all the way to your own awakening, to the moment when you finally see for yourself what the Buddha had seen, when you wake up. And therefore, it's veditabo venuhiti, to be understood individually, personally, by the wise. So, to me, when I remember when we're chanting that resonates very, very strongly. All those things that the Buddha's teaching is said to be there, they are both inspiring but also very real and very down to earth. You're not being taken away from yourself to some fantasy land. You're not being promised something in the never, never. The Buddha's teaching is something that you can engage with, connect with, right here and now. So then we come to the Sangha section, and this is a bit longer, but it's very repetitive. So I won't necessarily have to read the repetition, but it calls the Buddhist Sangha Bhagavato Savaka Sangho, which means the Sangha of hearers of the Buddha, because in those days that the Buddha lived, learning was from hearing. You didn't have books, you certainly didn't have audio guides and YouTube videos. if you wanted to learn, you learnt from another person directly. You listened to them, what they had to say. So that's Savaka Sangha. And Sangha actually has a sort of, it's like a collective noun. It can be applied to other groups. It's not specifically Buddhist. So in the early days of Buddhism, some of the guilds of craftsmen were Sanghas. They were the Sangha of the carpenters, or the Sangha of the stonemasons, or something like that. So this is the Sangha of hearers of the Buddha. It's the collective identity of the hearers of the Buddha. And they are said to be supatipanno, which means happily proceeding. I mean, presumably proceeding on the path. Often the Buddhist Dharma is seen as a way, a path from where you are now to enlightenment. And they are chupatipanno, which means uprightly proceeding. It's got the connotation of upright in an ethical sense. And then nyaya patipanno, methodically proceeding. So they also go step by step. And the members of the Sangha who engage with the Buddha's teaching take it step by step. They do it methodically. They do it bit by bit. And then sami chapatipanno, here he translates that as correctly proceeding. But in a seminar that I was on with him, he said it's more like harmoniously proceeding. It's the sense that those people are going along together. They're not just going along individually, but they're following the path in harmony with each other. And then there's a curious section where it says, Yadidam Chatari Purisa Yugani Atta Purisa Pugala, which means, namely, these 4 pairs of individuals, these 8 persons. Well, we haven't met 4 individuals or 8 persons yet. We've had some different epithets about the Sangha collectively. So this needs a bit of unpacking. So the 4 persons it's talking about, it's very clear that it's what's in Buddhism is called the Aryan Sangha, the noble Sangha, and that means those people who themselves have attained some insight into the nature of the world we live in. So they've had some direct experience that parallels the Buddha's. Now, the reason there's 4 is because that doesn't always take place fully in a moment. So the first stage of that is very important. We may come along to a center, we may learn, we may meditate, we may reflect. But when that moment arrives, when we see things the way that Buddha did, even if it's just for a moment, just a glimpse, it has a very profound effect on our lives. And that stage is sometimes called stream entry, because at that moment, you fully enter for the first time the stream that leads to enlightenment. It's almost as if you haven't really fully practiced before then, or you haven't practiced with the whole of yourself. But there are further stages, and in the early tradition, that was divided into someone who's called a once returner. So they only come back to this world of sort of human flesh and bone one more time. A non-returner who doesn't come back here at all. They continue to practice. They're not yet enlightened, but they practice in some sort of ethereal realm. And we may or may not believe that there is such a place, but certainly the early Buddhists who believed in these devas and spirits believed that there were sort of higher realms, and that it was possible to carry on practicing Buddhism in those. And the reason that you wouldn't come back here is because your desire and your aversion, your hatred, become attenuated and eventually you overcome them. So according to the Buddha, it's our craving for experience in this world that keeps us here. If we overcame that, we would want to still practice the Dharma, we would still have the desire to gain enlightenment, but we would do that, as it were, in the best possible circumstances. We wouldn't need to sort of rough it in the world that we currently live in, with all the distractions and all the obstacles that all of us face just in our ordinary everyday lives, let alone in our Dharma practice. And then finally, the fourth is the Arahant. And the Arahant is considered sort of, as it were, spiritually, mentally, emotionally equivalent to the Buddha. But the Buddha remains foremost because he was able to discover and reach that stage on his own, whereas the Arahants have had the benefit of the Buddha's teaching, and they've had the benefit of practicing within that context, maybe over quite a long time before they gained that state. And the reason it's then divided into 8 is because each stage is seen as having an active and a sort of passive component. So there's an active component where you're striving to achieve that state, and then there's a more passive where you're enjoying the state you've achieved. To be honest, it doesn't resonate for me in the same way as those epithets about the Buddha and the Dharma. And Sangha actually says this is definitely a later kind of elaboration, that in the very early days when the Buddha was wandering around, there was just a distinction between those who hadn't yet seen what he'd seen and those who had. And there wasn't much concern, because the Buddha knew that once you'd seen, even for a moment, what he had seen, you wouldn't give up the spiritual life. It was now something that you would carry on with over time. And it really didn't matter, in a sense, how far you got with it. The main thing was that you entered fully and completely, with all of your capacity, into transforming yourself. And that you didn't give that up, and that you didn't just rest on your oars, as it were, that you saw the need to do that. And that was sort of ever present with you, even when it was difficult, even when it was hard. And then there's a section which I find interesting, but again, I don't feel, for me, it resonates in quite the same way as those earlier 2 sections. So it says, Esa Bhagavato Savaka Sangho. So this community, this Sangha of the hearers of the Buddha is, and then it's ahuneo, which is worthy of respect, sometimes translated worthy of worship. Pahuneo, worthy of hospitality. Dakineo, worthy of offerings. And Angelikaraneo, worthy of salutation with folded hands. So this gesture, even now, if you go to India and someone greets you with respect, they'll put their hands up like this. You know, they won't shake hands. Well, in the modern life, they will shake hands. But, you know, the tradition is that this is how you greet someone, with respect. So it then says that the Sangha, the Buddha's Sangha, is Anuttarang, again, the highest, the utmost, the topmost. Punya Ketam Lokasati, the highest source of merit in the world. Punya is merit, and merit has a sort of curious position in the East, even now, because people often are motivated to do something to gain merit, and they feel that the merit gained can even be of benefit to other people, like their family members, even though their family members may not be leading a religious life, may not be leading a spiritual life. They feel that merit is something that has a sort of intangible benefit and can be given, spread around, as it were. But first you have to gain it. Now, I think all of this, what it says about the Sangha, is absolutely true. Of course the Sangha is worthy of respect. I mean, every human being is worthy of your respect, frankly. And worthy of hospitality, worthy of offerings, worthy of salutation with folded hands. But what I find is that it seems a little bit weak to me. It seems a bit distant. It seems like an outsider view of the Sangha, not an insider view. So what do I mean by this? Well, even the way the Sangha is described seems to me like an outsider view of the Sangha, not an insider view. I don't think that description of happily proceeding, uprightly proceeding, methodically proceeding, correctly proceeding, is really the way that an awakened person describes their practice. It's just not alive enough for me. I mean, think about it. We're talking about people who've woken up, whose total being has been stimulated in a completely new way by understanding the way the world works. They've turned in a new direction. There's a phrase from a much later form of Buddhism that describes the same process as turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness. So all the things that previously you took for granted, you thought would bring you happiness, you thought were necessary for your security, etc., you see through that. That's part of this insight. I mean, you still have a certain momentum. You don't gain enlightenment in a day, usually. But you begin to reorientate. You begin to transfer your energy in a new direction. And usually a lot of energy is released by that. I mean, even on a lesser level. For myself, when I first came across Buddhism, I'd already been seeking for 2 or 3 years, and I'd been homeless for a few months, and I'd been thinking a lot about what did I want? You know, I knew I wanted something spiritual, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what that was. I'd never really come across it. I tried sitting on my own in empty churches, but I thought, but actually I don't believe in God. You know, what am I doing here? You know, it's not going to be my way forward. And when I came across through meditation, but when I realized what Buddhism was, what a Sangha was, what the people trying to practice were trying to do, I felt, wow, this is what I was looking for. And it happened to be, by that time, it was sort of midwinter. I know we're having some very mild winters now, but believe me, it was very cold. I was living up in East Anglia, where the wind sweeps across the North Sea and cuts to the bone. But that winter, I literally did not feel the cold. I was so excited to have found something that fitted what I was looking for, that a huge amount of energy was released. And that energy was even physical, even meant I didn't feel the cold for a few months. Okay, those things die down, they're not permanent. But with insight, there is a permanent shift. There is a permanent change. And the more you orientate yourself towards something that works better than your normal strategies, the better you feel, the more energy is released, and the deeper you see. So it becomes a cumulative process, a positive cumulative process. So if we think about these 4 kinds of persons, these 8 individuals, with a bit of imagination, we realize it's not like, you know, the text makes it sound as if there's a sort of procession of rather graceful but rather distant figures walking off into the distance. No, it's not like that. These people are spontaneous, they're energetic, they're creative, they're dangerous. Contact with them will change your life. So that's why I say this is an outsider view, because I don't think that sense of danger and transformation is really contained by thinking that those people are worthy of worship, worthy of hospitality, etc. Of course they are. There's no denying that. I mean, worthy of offerings, you know, give them everything you've got. They're worthy of that. You know, support their work, make them able to teach humanity. Fantastic. But in still missing the point, you know, you're still, it's like being a donor to the Conservative Party, you know, instead of being Prime Minister. You know, you're a distant figure, not a public figure. These people are people that are transforming the life around them. And if you come into contact with that, your life is being transformed. And there's not much sense of that in the Sangha section. And it's tragic. And it's one of the tragedies of Buddhism that this distance, this separation started to occur between those who are really seriously practicing and those who are happy just to be followers, but keep their distance, as it were. You know, the Tibetans have a saying that great teachers are like incense. It smells really good from a distance, but it chokes you if you get too close. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Sometimes people keep their distance, as it were, on purpose. You know, it's safer. It's safer that way. But that's an outsider view. The insider view of the Sangha is that the Sangha is transformative. Sangha, actually, we don't see this much, but he had a book of his kind of little sayings. And one of them, he said, people come into touch with our own order, and what they see is the warmth of fellowship. But what they don't yet understand is that that's coming from the transformative fires of shunyata, of seeing things as they really are. So we have to kind of get away from this outsider view. We have to come into real living contact, if we can, with people who are more developed than us. The whole of Buddhism is really about that. So this is what I really wanted to come to, that what the Sangha is a process of lighting one candle from another, lighting one lamp from another. And that's how the Buddha's teaching comes down to the present day. It doesn't come down through books. I mean, it can, and books are useful. It certainly doesn't come down simply through institutions. It comes down through that live contact. And that's what we need to see as Sangha initially. We need to see Sangha as the lineage, the passing on of the teaching of the spirit and understanding of the Buddha, in whatever form that happens, from one person who's more developed to another person who wants to be more developed. And that we call sometimes Kalyana Mitrata. It's a beautiful friendship. It happens between people. And when it happens, all those people are drawn into the Sangha. So you don't get this divide. You don't get an insider-outsider view. You don't get people who are actually doing it, a few of them, and other people who are looking from a distance and saying, that's really wonderful, but I can't do that. So it's not lineage in a formal sense that I'm thinking of. It's not one of these things where you get a certificate, saying you've reached a certain stage and you pass an exam. And I mean, honestly, in the East, there are some situations where it's formalized in that way. Oh, you're a stream entrant. It's been, your teacher's signed a certificate saying so. No, it's not like that. In a way you don't want to know. It's very difficult to know another person fully. But sometimes what you do know is that they've just somewhere, they elude you. They elude you because they've gone beyond you in some way. So this is what I felt about Sangha. I'm not uncritical about Sangha. I don't think he had everything sorted out. He was a human being. He had some faults and failings. But I can tell you that in a study group, when you came into contact with him, when you questioned him, when you had the opportunity to pursue a line of thought, you could see that the answer was coming from a deeper place than you could possibly have got to on your own. And that's enough. That's all that matters, isn't it? That you have that opportunity to learn, to change, to move on from your more sort of limited way of thinking and being. So that's the first thing that I wanted to emphasize, is the fact that the Sangha is a living conduit for the Buddha's teaching. And in fact, that conduit doesn't even have to come from a person. But we need to feel that living presence. So sometimes order members do meditation practices in which they call to mind the Buddha or a great bodhisattva. And it's said that that figure, if you concentrate on that figure, can come alive for you. And that something of the Buddha's teaching can come to you directly from that figure. So it's that is the essential thing. It's the receiving of teachings, not formal teachings, not something that could come from a book, but something that sparks you off, that challenges you, that changes you for the better. And if that happens, then you also become a member of the Sangha. I mean, you might be a very junior member initially, but it's in our tradition, in Triratna, we try and get away from this sense of a divide, of an insider-outsider view. And one of the ways that Sangha has sort of promoted that, when I was ordained, my name Kulamitra means friend of the spiritual family. But Kula literally just means family. But in the later Buddhist tradition in India, they obviously felt that the word Sangha had become quite institutionalized. It kind of brought to mind great monasteries, processions of monks, big ceremonies, something, again, rather distant, rather removed from people's direct experience. So what became important was what they called the Vajra Kula. The Kula was the little group of disciples around a particular teacher that formed an intimate subsection of the Sangha. And when I was ordained with 3 other people, and each of us got the name Kula. Kula Deva, Kula Ratna, Kulamitra, Kulananda. And we'd all been friends before we got ordained together. We'd made friends as mitras coming along to the same centre. And Sangha really emphasised that this was a good thing and that you needed this kind of peer connection, very strong peer connection. and that would, as it were, carry you through some of the difficulties and obstacles that you would face in the spiritual life. So I think that sense of kula, you can expand it a little bit. It doesn't just have to be 4 of you, but the people in a particular center, the people that you know, the people that you practice with, the people that you open up to, the people that you go to and say your truth. I'm having difficulty with this. I don't find such and such easy. The people that you discuss with, that you come to conclusions with, that you study with, but again, not necessarily in a formal way. The people that you share your spiritual life with. This is really your Sangha, your kula, your intimate experience of Sangha, not as something different, distant and other, but as something immediate and present, so that it has that sense that did come out, I think, very well in these verses about the Buddhist teaching, that it's immediately apparent, that it's a personal invitation. Sangha should feel like that too. Sangha should be something that is equally meaningful with the Buddha and the Dharma. They're there, the threesome. In a way, they can't exactly be divided. They're sort of different aspects of the same thing. So we need to find that life. It's funny, I've got a phrase going through my head. It's actually from Talking Heads' Psycho Killer. Don't touch me, I'm a real live wire, it says. But you know, that's in a negative sense. But you want to meet people who are real live wires and are a bit dangerous to touch. Not dangerous in the sense that they'll lead you astray. No, on the contrary. Dangerous in the sense that they won't let you go astray, which is so often what you feel like doing. So that should be our experience of Sangha. That's what we're celebrating today. That's what we're aiming for. And it's something that's never going to be achieved, as it were. It's an ongoing process. It's something we need to engage with moment by moment, day by day, build on, make better. So it goes beyond just coming to the center to a class. It starts to involve other times and places. So Sangha actually said, great, if you want to play sport, that's quite good, but do it with a Sangha friend. That will make more of it. Go to your favorite concert or an art gallery, but take a Sangha friend with you who also appreciates that kind of thing. So we're making all these interconnections and building up a very positive framework for our own spiritual practice, something that will sustain us even through difficult times and difficult experiences. So that's what Sangha really is, or should be, or could be.